everyone, I'm Sinister Tales. Today, I'm narrating 10 terrifying stories from people who headed to remote cabins looking for peace and came back rattled. Before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps the channel, and you can always change your mind later. And if you've got ideas for the next video, drop them in the comments. I was 24 when I took a winter maintenance job at a small vacation property near Whitlow, tucked deep in the Allegheny Range. It was seasonal, quiet work, and by late November, most of the staff had already left. Dense woods, steep slopes, and the nearest town a good 20 miles out. Once the snow set in, it was basically just me. The property manager handed me a chunky two-way radio and a binder of emergency procedures. I slept in a caretaker's shack near the service shed. Honestly, I didn't mind it. The first couple weeks felt almost perfect. Wake up late, do a few checks, make coffee, read until dark. I've always liked being alone more than most people, and out there time felt stretched thin. No calls, no clocks, no noise, just snow, trees, and the occasional squirrel with an attitude. Then I had to hike out to cabin 11. It was the farthest one, perched up on a ridge with nothing else near it. There was a narrow trail, but nobody used it in winter, so it never got cleared after snowfalls. The cabin had been empty for months. I'd only been inside once before, in early October, to fix a busted cabinet door. I remember thinking the layout felt wrong, like it had been remodeled too many times, until nothing lined up anymore, too many walls, or not enough. The hike took maybe 45 minutes through packed snow. Not brutal, but I was winded by the time I reached the porch. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw the tracks. They looped around the cabin in a wide arc. Not boot prints, not animal. I first thought maybe someone had dragged branches, the way the snow was disturbed, until I got closer. Heel marks, clean human heels, no tread, no socks, bare feet in snow. I just stood there staring. It was well below freezing. Even imagining barefoot steps made my toes ache. I tried to talk myself into a reasonable explanation. A prank, a lost hiker, someone doing something stupid. None of it fit. Inside, the air hit me like the place had been sealed. Cold, dry, and threaded with a faint burnt wood smell that didn't belong. No guests had been there since September, and I hadn't used the fireplace when I'd last visited. The breaker was off, just like I'd left it. But the smell was fresh enough to be unmistakable. In the sink were 2 bowls with dried oatmeal crusted around the rims, like they'd sat there a day or two, not months. I checked the rest of the cabin. Nothing broken, nothing obviously forced, but everything felt subtly adjusted, like someone had been living there quietly and carefully. Furniture shifted just a little, the table not centered, one chair angled wrong. You'd miss it unless you'd been there before, and I had. Under the table, I noticed something pale stuck to the floor, several strands of long, light-colored hair, matted down by something faintly tacky. I didn't touch it. I didn't clean it. I locked up, made a note to report it, and told myself it was probably a squatter. That night, around 3:00 a.m., I was half awake when I heard knocking. Not from the door from the back wall of the shack. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, dead still, listening. I tried to blame the wind, a tree shifting, ice cracking, anything. Then it came again, same spot, same rhythm. I grabbed my flashlight and the radio, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. Nothing. My old boot prints were the only ones around the shack. The snow was untouched. The woods were quiet. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I called the office landline and left a message. I thought someone might be on the property. Maybe lost. Maybe squatting. I kept it vague. That afternoon, I hiked back to cabin 11, wanting to be sure. I brought a crowbar, just in case. The prints were there again, looping around the cabin, then cutting off into the trees. I followed them, maybe 50-60 feet. They ended at the edge of a dry stream bed. No drag marks, no exit trail. Just stopped, like whoever made them stepped out of the world. Inside the cabin, the kitchen drawers were open. Everything had been rummaged through. I couldn't tell what was missing, if anything, but it was obvious someone had handled it all. On the counter sat a roll of Kodak film. No camera, just the roll. I didn't touch it. I left, blocked the door again, and wrote it up like before. That night, it wasn't knocking. It was a woman's voice coming from the direction of the trail. Not shouting, not whispering, just steady talking, like she was telling a story to someone or to herself. I couldn't make out the words. It went on for a while, then stopped all at once, like someone flipped a switch. The next morning I walked toward where the voice had carried from, and ended up at the old utility cabin, an outbuilding. We used to store extra propane and busted tools. It had been shut for months. Last time I checked it, it had a padlock. Now the lock was gone. Inside, there were only 3 things: a torn mattress, a pile of clothes that looked like they'd been buried and dragged back up, and a rope tied into a loop hanging from a ceiling beam. On the wall, in black marker, was a list of names, 12 total, Most had years beside them. The last two were blank. That's when I heard footsteps behind me coming down the slope. I bolted the door from the outside and ran. That night, I stuffed everything I owned into my bag and hiked out through the woods. I didn't even bother with the road. I just kept moving until I hit asphalt around dawn. A trucker heading east picked me up near an old fire road and dropped me at a diner outside Winstead. I used the pay phone to call the office, told them I quit, and didn't explain. A few weeks later, I mailed the cabin key back. No note, no return address. Curiosity got me once. I looked up the names. One matched a missing person case, a woman from Maryland who vanished in 2006 while backpacking solo through the area. The other names never turned up. A few winters later, when I was 29 and didn't have much direction, a family friend offered me an off-season caretaking gig. He made it sound simple. Keep pipes from freezing, haul firewood, check the cabins before and after guests. Only 3 cabins stayed open in winter, clustered near the ridge. The rest were padlocked and dark until spring. I stayed in cabin 4. It was older and beat up, and you had to run a heater in the crawl space or the pipes would freeze solid. But the wood stove worked, the water ran, and I had it to myself. Most winter guests weren't adventurous couples in their 50s, sometimes families with little kids who wanted snow. 1 or 2 nights, rarely longer. I'd greet them, explain the propane heaters, confirm keys, then leave them alone unless something broke. A few days before Christmas, a man arrived alone. He said his name was Lonnie. Mid-50s, big, looked like he'd worked hard his whole life, leathery skin, crow's feet that suggested he smiled a lot, though he didn't smile much at me. He nodded more than he spoke, hands in pockets. Faded Carhartt jacket and boots worn down by years. He'd booked cabin 2 for 3 nights. I gave him the key and made the usual small talk. He mentioned hiking the area as a kid. When I asked where he was from, he paused just long enough to stand out, then said, "Upstate." No state. I let it go. Some people travel alone because they don't want conversation. Maybe he had his own reasons. The next morning, I went up the ridge to restock the firewood bins before the next snow. I found Lonnie behind cabin 31, one of the shut ones. That cabin faced a steep drop into thick woods. No trail, no view, no reason to be back there. When I called out, he flinched, not like he'd been startled, more like he'd been caught. He pointed at the snow and said, "Looks like a big cat came through here." He was pointing at squirrel tracks. I grew up around there. I know what mountain lion prints look like. Those weren't them. I didn't push it. I nodded and moved on. Later that day, I saw prints circling cabin 1, another empty cabin. They came out of the woods, looped behind the building, and vanished into the tree line. Not a path you'd take on a hike, just a strange little orbit. I assumed Lonnie was wandering, bored, restless. The next morning, there were new prints. This time, they went straight to my cabin, right up to the bottom step of my porch, and stopped. No one should have been near my place. That night, I left the porch light on and bolted the door. I wasn't panicking yet, but I felt keyed up, like some part of me was tracking something my mind hadn't admitted. Around 2:00 a.m., I heard 3 knocks. Slow, almost gentle, spaced about 3 seconds apart. Knock, knock, knock. I sat straight up and didn't move. No footsteps afterward. No voice, just silence. I didn't check the door. I stayed still until sunlight. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Branches, an animal, sighting shifting. Then, on the hike down to the maintenance shack, I saw it. A red paper triangle, palm-sized, folded neatly, and placed dead center on the trail. It was clean and dry, with no snow on it, like it had been set down moments before. I picked it up and unfolded it. Blank, just sharp creases, perfect lines. On the way back up, I passed cabin 2. Lonnie sat at the window, not reading, not on his phone, just staring straight at my cabin, not the trees, not the trail, my cabin. That night, I locked everything, hauled the remaining wood pile inside, kept the stove hot, set the fireplace poker beside my bed, and left every light on. I read for hours, waiting. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke in darkness. All the lights were out. The switches were still up. The fuse box looked normal, no breakers tripped. Then the knocks came again. 3 taps, same rhythm, same pressure. I stood frozen, heart pounding. I waited 10 minutes before I forced myself to look out the window. No one outside, but the prints had returned, leading away from my porch and cutting toward the woods. At dawn, I followed them. They wound through the trees and past cabin 3 again. One window was open. That cabin had been locked. I went in with a flashlight. Cold, stale, dust everywhere. No bedding disturbed, no food, no boots by the door. But in the back room, behind a curtain, someone had written on the wall in pencil, "She looks just like her." I walked straight to the landline and called the owner. I told him everything: the prints, the knocks, the triangle, the open window, the writing. While we spoke, he checked the reservation. Lonnie had paid cash. No real last name, no ID. Cabin 2 was listed as occupied. I went back to cabin 2. It was empty, bed stripped. No sign anyone had stayed there. He never returned for the key. That night, I barricaded the windows, stacked furniture against the door, and kept the stove roaring until sunrise. I didn't sleep. I waited out the week, packed early, and told the owner I was done. I drove down from Pennsylvania to deal with my uncle's old cabin in the Highlands, a quiet place that felt like the right kind of escape after he died. Nobody else in the family wanted anything to do with it. Remote, creepy, whatever. The cabin sat about 10 miles past a barely marked town called Cedar Hollow, tucked into the Blue Ridge like it had been dropped there and forgotten. Cedar Hollow was mostly a general store, a post office that doubled as a bait shop, and a diner that always looked closed. People were polite but brief. They nodded, held doors, didn't linger. An older guy at the store asked if I planned to stay through winter. When I said I might, he gave a tight smile and muttered, "Hope you're good with being real alone." A younger woman said, "It gets weird up there," and left it at that. Behind the cabin, my uncle had cut trails, one along the ridge for firewood runs, another down toward a dry creek bed. Every few days, I'd clear the main trail, packing it down with my boots. Routine more than anything. Then the trail began to change. At first, I thought I was remembering wrong. But about 2 weeks in, I noticed the packed path. The one I'd stamped flat myself was curving harder left than I'd ever laid it. My old boot tracks were still there, veering right where the trail should go. But a new path, cleanly pressed like it had been walked repeatedly, drifted left toward the trees and the creek slope. The snow on it wasn't slushy or wind-scoured. It looked tamped by boots, just not mine. I kept to my original track, chopped wood, warmed up by the fire, told myself snow shifts and wind plays tricks. Still, that slow bend felt deliberate. That night, I heard 3 taps on the cabin wall. Not wind, not branches. 3 evenly spaced knocks. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on a jacket, and stepped outside. The cold hit like a slap. Nothing moved. No wind. No wildlife. Just the oil heater clattering inside and ice settling in the gutters. A few days later, I checked the trail again and found a child's glove, light blue knit, frayed cuff lying right where the new path split off. It looked freshly dropped. No snow dusting it, no moisture soaked in. I picked it up with my sleeve and stared. There were no kids anywhere near that place. The nearest house was 5 miles down a rutted road that didn't look like it had seen children in decades. That glove didn't belong. That night, I threw it into the fireplace and watched it curl and blacken. In the morning, a different glove sat in the same spot. Red, missing one finger. I didn't touch it. I turned around. After that, I stayed busy indoors, fixing cabinet doors, tightening floorboards, sorting through my uncle's leftover tools, hunting gear, and books I didn't feel like reading. In a locked drawer under the bed, I found one of his notebooks, dated entries in small, neat cursive. Weather notes, animal sightings, equipment issues. But every few pages, something didn't fit. Ben shifted again. Heard it walking last night. Most often, not this winter, maybe spring. One line stopped me, trail behind chimney bends again. Left a marker gone. So I checked behind the chimney. The yard sloped up into dead pine and bramble. Not a trail exactly, just compressed snow leading toward the trees. The impressions were deeper than mine, broader, heavier. I stood at the base of the slope a long time, trying to convince myself to follow. I didn't. That night, the tapping returned, 3 knocks, but from the opposite side of the cabin. I lay under the covers, barely breathing, listening until the heater clicked on and filled the place with its familiar mechanical whine. A storm came the next day and killed the landline. Cell service never worked up there, but the landline had been steady until then. When the roads cleared enough to drive into Cedar Hollow, I mentioned the glove to the woman at the store. I left out the tapping and the shifting trail. She barely reacted. She only asked if I'd seen any sheds out back. I said no. She nodded once. Good. Best to keep it that way. I didn't ask what she meant. Back at the cabin, sounds started metal clanging in the woods, spaced out, like distant tools striking each other. Once I thought I heard a voice, low and slow and far away, too indistinct for words. I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, scanned the trees, waited. Nothing. After that, I began logging facts, not feelings. Times, locations, what I moved, what I heard. I used my uncle's notebook. The longer I stayed, the more my handwriting started to resemble his. One morning, I found the front door unlatched. I always locked it at night, double-checked by habit. The deadbolt was still thrown, knob untouched, but the latch had been released. Centered on the doormat, someone had arranged dried pine needles into a ring. No footprints, just the ring. Later, in the shed, a rusted tin can hung from a nail, swinging gently. I was sure that wall had been bare. I watched it sway until it stopped. That night, the heater died. Generator still running. Oil tank full. No obvious reason. It just shut off. I lit the wood stove, but the cold felt like it had already seeped into my bones. In the morning, the trail had changed again. The bend was broader now, almost a loop, and sticks had been planted along the new route, evenly spaced. 8 of them knee-high, perfectly upright in a straight line. At the top of the curve, where the trail disappeared into the trees, someone had laid an arc of stones. 7 stones. They hadn't been there the day before. I didn't touch anything. I didn't follow. That night, I packed a bag with essentials and stayed awake until dawn, sitting by the fire with my coat on. Before leaving, I walked the cabin one last time, locked the door from inside, climbed out through a window, and took care not to disturb the snow. My footsteps were the only ones. I walked to the truck without looking toward the woods. I didn't look back. The next day, I paid a guy from town, his cousin, or something, to haul the rest of my stuff. Now I live in a small apartment above a shop. I still have the notebook, my uncle's handwriting braided through mine. I don't hike anymore. I don't go near forests when it's snowing. When winter comes, I draw the curtains before sunset. My name's Corin. I spent one winter doing inventory checks for a company that ran seasonal retreats deep in the Appalachian backwoods. They issued me a snowmobile, a master key, and a thick binder of maps and diagrams. Everything was supposed to be shut down for winter. My job was to enter each cabin, confirm the inventory matched, and note damage or anything out of place. Most cabins were far apart, sometimes a 20-minute ride between them along tight trails through muffling snow. Cabin 33 was wrong from the start. To reach it, you had to peel off the main loop and drop into a gully where rock slabs and tight trees kept everything in shadow. Even at midday, it looked like dusk down there. The snow never crusted or melted. It stayed soft, like the sun and wind couldn't find it. The place felt forgotten by the property and by the woods. Outside, I noticed a slight sag to the roofline, just enough to make the whole structure look off balance. Frost had formed between the double panes of the windows, which shouldn't happen with sealed glass. None of the other cabins had that. When I unlocked the door and stepped in, the cold hit harder than it should have. The other winterized cabins still held a stale warmth, trapped air, insulation doing its job. Cabin 33 felt sharp and fresh, like cold rising from underneath the floor instead of leaking in. I started the checklist anyway. Bed frame, check. Windows, no cracks. Kitchen table, 4 chairs. stove unplugged, all normal. Then I saw a quilt draped over the couch, dark, heavy, a broken diamond pattern, hand-stitched. It wasn't on the inventory list. I assumed a guest left it, and nobody logged it, so I added a note, unlisted textile couch. Then I turned back toward the room and stopped. The couch had moved, not far, but unmistakably rotated. When I entered, it had been aligned with the fireplace. Now it was angled toward the window, maybe 20 degrees, enough to catch your eye. I thought maybe I'd bumped it, or the floor was uneven. I pressed my knee into it. It didn't budge. It was heavy, planted, the kind of couch that takes effort to shift. I shoved it back into place, blamed my memory, and continued. The kitchen was fine. Pantry empty like it should be. Cabinets latched. No leaks. No mildew. I took the required photos with the company-issued tablet. As I snapped the living room, the screen dimmed for a blink, not the whole device, just the live image, like the light inside the cabin dropped by a fraction. I looked up. Nothing changed. The snow outside looked identical. No passing cloud. No wind. The next morning, the binder was back on my porch with a sticky note. Cabin 33 paperwork incomplete. Return for verification. I knew I'd submitted it. I remembered filling every line and taking the photos. But the tablet folder for 33 was empty, no images, no saved form. Cabins 32 and 34 were fine. 33 was gone, so I went back. The gully felt colder, even under a clear sky. Near the back steps, I spotted boot prints, small ones, not mine, close together, like someone was taking careful steps or walking barefoot inside boots. They led from the back steps into the woods and ended abruptly. Not faded, not drifted over, just stopped. Inside, the cabin looked the same, except a folded paper sat on the dining table. My inventory sheet from the day before. My handwriting. But every item was crossed out with perfectly straight lines. Next to it, a new column listed replacements for everything I'd marked as present. The writing looked like mine, but too clean, too measured, as if someone had traced it with a ruler. The spacing was unnaturally precise. I hadn't written that. I didn't even understand half the replacement entries. I slid it into the binder and filled out a fresh sheet. Before leaving, I realized the quilt was missing. I checked the couch, under the table, corners, floor. Nothing. Finally, I opened the narrow utility closet off the back hall, the one I hadn't opened before. There it was, folded perfectly on a shelf beside a snapped broom handle and a broken snow shovel. time, I locked the cabin carefully, checking it 3 times. A couple days later, they sent me again. Entry inconsistencies, they said. Bring your own notes if you want. So I did, my own notebook, a backup tablet. When I arrived, the door wasn't latched. Not open, just resting in the frame, like someone hadn't pulled it shut. I was the only one with a key that season. I hadn't told anyone I was coming back. Inside, the couch was fully turned toward the window now, as if someone had dragged it over to sit and look out. The quilt was back, spread across the seat. The pillow had a shallow dip, like someone had leaned there a long time. I backed out and circled the cabin looking for prints. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of entry, just smooth, untouched snow. I took photos, made notes, locked up again, and left. That night, back in my own cabin, the tablet on the counter vibrated. It wasn't supposed to. There was no signal, no network. The screen lit with a notification. New entry saved. Cabin 33. I opened it. One image. The couch turned toward the window. Someone was sitting on it, seen only from behind black coat, slumped posture, no face visible. Metadata said it was taken 4 minutes earlier. I hadn't left my cabin. I stayed awake until sunrise. As soon as it was light, I drove to the nearest ranger station and reported signs of squatters at one of the properties. I didn't explain beyond that. They checked the cabin and called me later. It looked fine. Couch back in place. No quilt. No evidence anyone had been staying there. 3 days after that, I quit. I left the keys, the binder, the tech in the company return box, and drove straight off the mountain. The office sat in the basement of the older wing of Briarford Municipal Hall, a place people forgot existed unless they needed a birth certificate in a hurry. I worked alone that month because the archive director was on extended leave, and nobody else wanted to spend winter mornings underground with brittle files and a furnace that behaved like a mood. I liked the quiet. I liked being where nothing could tug my attention sideways. I was sorting intake forms when I noticed the first wrong thing. A single box labeled with a date from 2 decades earlier sat on the central table. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't even unlocked that aisle yet. The lid was cocked open as if someone had gone through it quickly. I checked the access log. No one but me had the basement key that week. Inside were folders I recognized from a section I'd organized the day before. But the order was reversed, like the set had been disassembled and rebuilt backward. The papers looked crisp and undisturbed, but the pattern was obvious. I fixed the order, slid the box under the table, and forced myself not to spiral. My hands trembled, so I focused on the heater. The furnace down the hall hummed, but near the storage racks, the air felt colder than it should, like the chill was following me. I ran my fingers along the metal shelf edges, searching for a vent or draft I'd missed. Nothing, just that steady cold. By midday, I told myself it was nerves or hunger. I heated soup in the tiny staff microwave. While I ate, I heard a faint clatter from the far aisle, the soft knock of a box nudged by a foot. I froze mid-spoon. Silence. When I stood, my legs felt unsteady. I walked the aisle expecting a mouse or a fallen folder. Instead, I found the same box. It wasn't under the table anymore. It sat dead center in aisle 3, perfectly aligned. Lid open again. I didn't touch it. The cold there felt denser, like a pocket of air that didn't belong in that room. I backed away slowly, keeping it in sight until I turned the corner. Then I locked myself in the small office by the stairs and stayed there until my shift ended. The next morning, the basement felt normal, warmer, almost friendly. I tried to stick to routine: intake, sorting, indexing. But when I returned from shelving a stack of forms, my notebook lay open on my desk, turned to a page I hadn't used since the previous month. My handwriting filled half the sheet, notes I recognized, but scrambled. Sentences broken mid-thought and finished lines later. Dates in the margin I didn't remember writing. I closed the notebook and shoved it into my coat pocket. I kept it zipped inside my coat all day. By the third morning, those cold pockets had spread. Some aisles felt fine, others felt sharp and heavy, like stepping into air left outside overnight. Breathing there made my nose sting. Shallow breaths made me dizzy. I decided to work in the cataloging room, where the air felt neutral. I pulled old property rolls and began entering them into the system. The rhythm helped until I reached a page stamped with a name I knew I hadn't typed. My own. Clean and centered, as if it had always been part of the record. I flipped back, then forward. It stayed. I checked the change log. Nothing. No edits. No additions. The computer showed the document untouched since the original scan. My first instinct was to leave, but the only stairs out were narrow and dim, and the thought of turning my back to the aisles tightened my throat. So I stayed near the wide doorway, clutching the laptop to my chest like a shield. That's when I heard filing drawers. One slid open in the back, smooth, deliberate. Then another dragged farther, as if pulled fully out. I couldn't see into the aisles from where I stood, but I knew the layout. Whatever was moving wasn't wandering. It was progressing in a straight line, drawer by drawer, row by row. My hands shook so badly, I set the laptop on the floor. The drawers stopped. The furnace kicked on. The silence afterward felt weighted, like the room was holding its breath with me. I stepped into the doorway slowly. The far rows looked normal. No drawers left open, no paper spilled. But the cold in the distant aisle was so sharp I could see my breath drift. I took a step, then another. My fingertips skimmed the metal shelves for balance. I kept my eyes low, fixed on the concrete. That's when I saw a single sheet of paper laid perfectly flat in the center of the aisle blank. I crouched without touching it. From that angle, I caught faint indentations, writing pressed into the page without ink, like someone traced a message with a dull pencil. I tilted my head until the letters surfaced. My name followed by a time that hadn't happened yet. 6:14. My breath went thin. I checked my watch. 6:12. I stood too fast and clipped my shoulder on the rack. Papers shifted somewhere behind me. I didn't turn. I ran past cataloging, past intake, up the narrow stairs 2 at a time. I shoved the door so hard it slapped the wall. I didn't stop until I reached the main hall, flooded with daylight from tall windows that made everything feel absurdly normal. My pulse hammered. I checked my watch again. 6:15. I knew I should have left for good right, then called someone, filed a report, anything. Instead, I paced the hall until my breathing settled, then went back down, one hand gripping the rail the whole way. The basement looked exactly as I'd left it. Warm, still. The paper was gone. Every drawer was closed. The furnace hummed. No missing time. I finished my shift without stepping into the aisles again. At closing, I packed calmly, shut off the lights, locked up, and walked straight to human resources to resign. That winter, I was the only one out there. I'd signed on as the off-season caretaker for a conservation trust. The job was basic. Shovel snow off roofs so they didn't collapse. Check for fallen trees or broken windows, and radio in each night if anything seemed off. I'd done similar work before, just not this remote. The isolation didn't bother me. It was the point. After a few rough years, being alone with a wood stove and a checklist felt like the right kind of quiet. By November, the snow was already heavy. After a few storms, the trails vanished under drifts, and I stopped pretending to follow them. I made my own packed paths from cabin to cabin. My cabin was the southernmost, and the only one with a reliable stove. So I never stayed overnight in the others. I kept a strict routine. Up early, boil water, gear up, and walk a clockwise loop. Cabin 1, 2, 3, 4, then back to mine. I didn't change the order. Not once for the first month. 3 Mondays after the last supply drop, I saw something strange outside cabin 3. The snow near the door wasn't marked by normal foot traffic. It was pressed smooth in a wide patch. No tread, no prints, more like something had been dragged over it, blanket, body. I didn't know. And the door was cracked open slightly. None of the cabins had locks, but I always shut doors tight. I'd been there 2 days earlier, and I knew I'd closed it. Inside was quiet and cold. 2 bunks, a narrow table, plastic storage crates, the usual. But it smelled musty, like wet canvas sealed in a room. On the back wall, the small window above the bed was cracked open. That hit me harder than it should have, because earlier in the month, I'd sealed it shut with plastic and duct tape when the wind picked up. Now the tape had been peeled back slowly, cleanly. Not torn, not ripped, peeled. I resealed the window, shut the door, and finished my loop, distracted the whole time. I couldn't shake the care in that peeling. Wind doesn't do that. Animals don't do that. Even a lost hiker doesn't usually do that. Back at my cabin, I paused at the door. Nothing looked wrong, but the feeling wouldn't let go. That night, I left my boots inside instead of on the porch, kept the lantern burning longer, latched the door, and tested it twice. The next morning, at cabin 4, I stopped dead. Footprints looped up to the porch, circled it twice, and ended at the front window. They were mine. Same tread, same stride, same slight drag on the left from an old tendon issue. But I hadn't been there in 3 days, and the snow was fresh. These prints were sharp and clean, no melt, no drift. I crouched and compared the depth to mine from that morning. Identical. That night I tried the radio. Only static, probably ice on the relay tower. It wasn't unheard of, but it still tied a knot in my chest. I left the lantern low and kept my knife close, the hatchet beside my sleeping bag. Sometime in the night, I heard 2 footsteps on the porch. Not pacing, just 2 deliberate steps, like someone walked up to the door and stopped. No knock, no retreat, nothing after. I didn't move until weak daylight leaked through the window cracks. The next day, I skipped the loop. I chopped wood, paced the clearing, stared at the tree line like it might blink. Late afternoon, I walked to the trailhead and back, like I could reset something by choosing it. When I returned, something was pinned to my cabin door. One of my inventory pages, folded neatly and fastened with a sharpened stick. I recognized it immediately. Handwritten notes torn clean from the log I kept by the radio. I unfolded it and felt my stomach drop. Stop changing the order. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I fed the stove, and every hour or two stepped outside with the axe and walked the perimeter. I never saw movement, but I saw something worse. My trailhead tracks, every single one had a twin. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Someone had walked beside my exact footprints, not stepping in them, mirroring them. Even where I'd slipped, the scuff was matched. Inside, I shoved the dresser in front of the door. In the morning, I forced myself to resume the loop, maybe to prove something was still mine. Cabin 1 looked fine. Cabin 2 quiet. At cabin 3, the door was sealed shut, latched from the inside. That shouldn't have been possible. The latches were inside-only twist closures. Through the window, the bunk was made up with corners folded neatly, tucked tight. The whole cabin looked untouched, tidy in a way that didn't belong out there. At cabin 4, more tracks, circling counterclockwise this time. I stood at the bottom step a long time, then turned away. Back in my cabin, the inventory log was gone. Every page torn out. In its place, centered on the table, lay a bundle of dried mountain laurel tied with twine. I didn't touch it. I didn't eat. I sat with the axe across my lap, listening for anything that didn't fit. After midnight, something moved on the roof, not footsteps, but a slow dragging scrape, like something pulling itself from one edge to the other. I stayed still until morning. At first light, I opened the stove and shoved the laurel bundle inside. I watched it burn down to ash, then packed my gear, left a note by the radio, and walked out through the snow. No stomping, no pauses at the cabins. Around midday, I reached the relay tower, climbed it, cleared ice from the dish, and finally raised someone on the emergency channel. A ranger met me at the valley edge by sundown, his snowmobile rumbling like salvation. I didn't explain much. I only said I was done. Now I live 2 counties away. This was about 5 years ago. Even now, there are parts of it I still can't make sit right in my head. A friend of my cousin Dale owned a handful of off-grid cabins near the Virginia-Kentucky border. I was between jobs and figured quiet wouldn't kill me. The only problem was how remote it was. The access road ended at a ranger station, and after that, it was a narrow snowmobile trail. Dale left me an old snowmobile beat up, like it had survived every blizzard since the 80s, but it ran. There were 7 cabins scattered along the ridge. Some were basically sheds with cots, Others were more like small houses. I stayed in cabin 3, the biggest, because it had a working stove and a backup radio. The first few days were nothing but cold and quiet. Every afternoon I rode the trail, checked each cabin, logged the date, made sure pipes hadn't burst and animals hadn't moved in. For a while it was almost peaceful. Day 4, cabin 6 changed that. The lock was broken, latch split at the edge like someone had forced it open. Inside, though, nothing was disturbed. No prints, no mess, nothing missing. I stood there trying to convince myself I'd missed it earlier, but I knew I hadn't. It had been locked on my last check. I radioed Dale. His cousin answered, told me to document it, secure it as best I could, and watch for more. I found a chain in the tool shed, looped it through the door handles, padlocked it, and noted I'd grab a replacement lock from the supply bin near cabin 1. That night, I was in my cabin trying to stay warm when the stove fans started clicking off and on. It ran off solar with battery backup, and it had been steady until then. I figured snow covered the panel, so I pulled on my coat and went out to brush it clear. The cold felt heavy, like something pressing against me. Fresh snow, no prints but mine, stars bright, woods tense, like everything was holding its breath. Back inside, while I stomped snow from my boots, the radio clicked on by itself, static first, then a voice barely cutting through. You're not in 6. It stopped me cold. The radio wasn't even tuned to the Ranger channel, and I hadn't touched it. I shut it off, then flipped the breaker and killed the whole system. I lit the backup lantern instead. Its orange light barely reached the corners. I didn't sleep much. At first light, I went straight to cabin 6. The chain was still tight, untouched. Inside, one thing was different. The small square mirror over the sink faced the wall. I couldn't swear it hadn't been like that, but it felt wrong. I took a photo and left. The other cabins were normal until cabin 1, the smallest, far down the trail where the trees thickened. The moment I opened the door, a wave of chemical stink rolled out. Kerosene strong enough to sting my eyes. That cabin didn't have a working heater, and there was no fuel stored inside, but the odor clung to the air. I found nothing that explained it. I left without touching anything. That night, I sat on the porch with the lamp off, watching the tree line. The silence was so complete, I could hear ice settling on the roof. Around midnight, something stepped out from the trees upright. Too far to see details, but it didn't move like a deer. It took slow, measured steps, stopped, and faced me. I didn't move. Neither did it. Eventually, I went inside and locked the door, and I left the lamp on until morning. Day 6, outside cabin 5, I found my inspection log lying in the snow, perfectly dry. It hadn't been there the day before. When I opened it, the last entries were blacked out with thick permanent marker, pressed so hard it tore the pages. The only line still readable said, "Don't open again." I photographed it and left without checking the door. That night at about 2:00 a.m., I woke to knocking 2 short knocks, then silence. I held my breath. 10 minutes passed, then one single knock. I got up, turned on the lamp, and looked through the peephole. No one. I cracked the door, still nothing. The snow on the porch was undisturbed. No prints, no wind, nothing. I jammed a chair under the handle and stayed awake until sunrise. Day 7, outside cabin 2, I found boot prints that weren't mine, wider tread. They led about 10 yards into the woods and stopped like they'd been cut off mid-step. No melt, no scuff. Cabin 2 inside looked untouched. I didn't linger. At exactly 9:00 that night, the radio turned on again. Same voice, same flat tone. "It's almost time. You should be in 6. I didn't hesitate. I yanked it out of the wall, went outside, and buried it behind the shed under a few feet of snow. That should have ended it. At 3:00 a.m., I heard the voice again, muffled, like it came through walls or from underground. "You were supposed to answer." I sat in a chair with my boots on, coat zipped, shovel across my knees. At one point, I heard slow crunching circling the cabin, like pacing. I didn't go out. By dawn, I was packed. I tied everything down, fought the snowmobile into starting, and left. At the ranger station, I handed over the keys, dropped off the logs and photos, and walked away without explaining. I took a seasonal job with a small logistics outfit that did winter deliveries to remote cabins in the Blue Hollow region, mostly out-of-towners who wanted their places stocked and warmed before holiday trips. The days were long and cold, the pay mediocre, but solitude beat customer service. About 4 days before Christmas, my supervisor Len handed me a folded map with 3 cabins circled in red. He tapped one circle and said, "Once you pass Carter's Ridge, cell S going to cut out. Just a heads up. And don't hang around up there longer than you need to. People can be particular." The first 2 drops were normal. Groceries, propane, fire starters. Unlock, unload, turn on the heater, leave. No cars, no fresh tire marks, just wind, snow, woods. The 3rd cabin was farther way out, up a winding hill road that hadn't been plowed in a week. I chained the tires and crawled along like I was hauling glass. By the time I arrived, the sky was already dimming, just past 4:00. The cabin looked odd, low and narrow, built right into the hillside, like it had been carved out of the slope. Every blind was pulled tight, but smoke threaded from the chimney, meaning someone was there. That wasn't unheard of around the holidays. I knocked once, then twice. The door cracked open. A man stood there, mid-40s maybe, pale as peeled fruit, in a battered hunting coat. He didn't greet me. He just stared like he hadn't expected anyone and didn't like surprises. I gave him the routine line. "Hi, I'm with Errol Hollow Supply. Scheduled drop-off for the Brenly cabin." He didn't answer. He opened the door wider and gestured loosely for me to come in. I hesitated. Locals could be standoffish, but it wasn't the weirdest interaction I'd had. I carried the bins inside. No lights, just firelight. The place was warm but silent. No radio, no TV, no hum, only the crackle of flames. The man stayed near the back wall, not speaking, watching. I unloaded canned goods and flour onto the counter, trying not to dwell on the quiet. When I turned to leave, I realized there was someone else. A second man sat in a rocking chair in the far corner. I hadn't seen him at all when I entered. Same pale, washed-out look. He didn't blink, didn't move. Hands on the chair arms, eyes fixed somewhere just over my shoulder. I nearly dropped my clipboard. The first man stepped forward, still silent, handed me the signed slip, and opened the door for me. I didn't speak. I walked out fast, boots crunching. Something in my gut told me not to look back until I was inside my truck with the door shut. When I finally glanced up, the blinds had been raised. Both men stood at the window watching me, unblinking. I drove down the hill in silence, white-knuckling the wheel to the main road. 2 days later, after a storm, Len sent me to check on a regular Mr. Callan, who lived closer to the Virginia state line in easier terrain. He was in his 70s, but sharp. His generator was making a strange noise. I found him behind his cabin, hammering ice off a shed roof. He waved like we were related. Completely different vibe from the Briar Bend cabin. After some small talk, he asked if I'd help shovel a drift that had buried his propane tank. I followed him around back. The moment we were out of sight of the driveway, his tone shifted. "You been up toward Briar lately?" he asked. I told him I had and mentioned the two men. He stopped walking. "That place up near Sutter Pass," I nodded. He went quiet for a beat, then said, "That cabin's been empty since my brother passed. Those boys don't leave tracks." I gave a short laugh, not because it was funny, but because my brain didn't know what else to do. He didn't laugh. He looked down at my boots and said, "You check those before you go inside your house. You should. They cling." That word followed me home. Cling. When I got back, I stripped on the porch coat, gloves, boots, socks, and inspected everything like I expected something to crawl out of the tread. Nothing did, but I didn't sleep right. The week after that, I got assigned another remote drop snowshoes, 1.5 miles in, dragging a sled loaded with pantry supplies and firewood. No vehicle access. The trail was ice stiff, the air still and sharp, and it was quiet in a way that made my jaw ache. I rounded a bend and saw the cabin. Something was wrong. The door was cracked open, swaying slightly. Snow was undisturbed except for a set of footprints that weren't mine. I called out. No answer. I stepped inside slowly. Fireplace lit. Kettle on the stove, steam hissing softly. And on the mat by the door, 3 pairs of boots were lined up perfectly, 1 large, 1 medium, 1 small. I called again. No response. I backed out, grabbed the sled rope, and didn't stop until I reached the truck. Later that day, Len called. "You get that cabin stocked?" I told him no, that it was already occupied, and something felt wrong. A pause. Then he asked, "Was there a white bowl on the porch?" I blinked. "What, a white ceramic bowl? If it's out, you don't go in. That's the rule. Should have told you sooner." "Why?" I asked. "Who leaves the bowl?" He didn't answer. My last route was to a set of hunting cabins near Powell Creek. The client was listed as Mr. Washburn. He hadn't checked in since the last snow, and Len wanted confirmation the place was still reachable. This time, I had a partner, Corey. Good guy. He'd been with the company longer than me, carried a lucky coin, talked to his truck like it was a dog. We snowshoed in together. About 20 minutes out, we saw footprints leading toward the cabin. Not boots, bare feet, and the snow beneath them looked melted, like the skin that made them was warm. Corey crouched and touched one. It was still wet. Who the hell goes barefoot in this? We reached the cabin, knocked. Nothing. Opened the door. Heat punched us in the face, too hot. The fireplace was roaring like someone had poured fuel into it. Inside, everything felt wrong. The furniture looked damp and sagging, as if it had been steamed from the inside. Corey stepped in, then froze. "You hear that?" I didn't until I did. Whispering. Not English. Under it, a wet, rhythmic clicking, like bones in a pipe. We backed out without a word and didn't stop until the truck came into view. On the way out, we noticed patterns on the trees, spirals traced through frost. At first, I tried to tell myself it was natural, but the shapes were too consistent, too repeated, like someone had burned them in with a hot nail. That night, I quit. By March, I'd moved out, broke my lease early, didn't tell my landlord why. I never spoke to Corey again.